Now you have to get our verbal consent now that the recording is on.
Well, let me see if I can put it here.
Oh man, I'm gonna go pee again. I'm sorry.
You know this is immortalized on Yvon's computer now.
This should be part of the. You should include this as like the opening of the voice memo. Is me saying I'm gonna go pee again.
Well, you can't. This is too meta. You should just say I'm gonna go pee again and then pee.
Okay, wait. I'm gonna go pee again, you guys.
Oh, what? Sorry, I cut you off. Say it again.
Oh, I'm gonna go pee, you guys. That good?
That was great.
Okay, good. I'm gonna go pee.
Okay.
Okay. Boy, I don't know. He's he pees often and yeah,
I think that's okay.
Yeah.
Oh, he's back.
He's back.
So, Yvon, did the music, those two tracks, did you organize them? I was curious how much of it was just the natural output, how much of it was quantized or comped on your end?
There's a lot of comping. Like I started with a stem of my stuff, and then it created 3 different versions of like a response to that. And I used all 3 of them, but comped them in a way that kind of made it sound, again, more organized, even though it was still pretty disorganized. And then I kind of added something of my own, but I wanted it to sound a bit like what AI sounds like. So the idea was to have it kind of a seamless back and forth. And then with the second song, it was very like comped and very deliberately fed like tiny prompts so that it could generate like another snippet of a chorus or a verse or a bridge.
I liked the songs. They're both very different, but the fact that it was created by this AI jukebox, you perceive it in a different way. I'm constantly thinking like, what's natural? What did Yvon do? What did the AI do? Does it matter? How much do these interact with each other?
I think that kind of opens the question, the broader question of like, is there a distinction between, a human making music and this algorithm trying to figure out what music is? I figure out is a weird phrase because it implies agency on the part of the software, even though it has no agency. You're the one executing all of the agency. But
I think the distinction becomes more and more blurry the more you try to define it, because when you are creating music, and Yvon, we've done this where you jam, like this idea of jamming, how conscious is this decision to create the next chord or to move your fingers in a certain way or strum in a certain pattern or sing a certain note? It's very intuitive almost, and you get into this groove where, based on your previous experience, your previous training, your knowledge about how music is supposed to work, 1, 4, 5 chords, whatever, you kind of naturally just go to what you think will sound good. But in essence, that's how this AI algorithm works. It's been trained on music. It's got music theory built into it somehow. It didn't learn it, but it was trained on it, and it knows just through hearing millions of hours of music or however they did it. It's just picked up on, or it's developed an intuition for how music is supposed to sound, that there's a tempo, that it's in 4/4, that you have certain chord progressions that naturally follow that are pleasing to the human ear. When you get right down to it, the way that AI creates it versus how you create it is equally mysterious.
That's fascinating, because you talked about sort of the unconscious production of music, the way that jamming is this unconscious process far more than it is conscious, and then tied that to AI, almost as if kind of the implication there is that AI functions like an unconscious. What are we trying to replicate? Are we trying to replicate consciousness or unconsciousness? When you look at a lot of like AI discussions, they oftentimes almost seem to imply that there is no such thing as the unconscious, that there is no such thing as sort of hidden motivations of which we are unaware. It's still all as if all that makes up the intelligence of a human is our capacity to consciously think. And I think that's wild. And I think Ryan comes up with a cool point that it's what are we necessarily trying to make intelligent, and what part are we trying to computationalize?
Well, and particularly with AI and art, art is so much kind of mystifying inspiration, unconscious processes. So when the AI spits stuff out at you, and you hear it and you think, oh, that was brilliant. It just sort of came up with that. Yeah, it feels like it pulls something out from like a well of inspiration. It has to dig something up for you. And so sometimes it gets stuck, like it's blocked. And then other times it gives you something very rich. And even like when it gives you voices, things talking in the background, or they're talking very loudly all of a sudden, like where is it getting that? So to me, like it's hard not to anthropomorphize the AI, but maybe it's important to anthropomorphize it. I don't know. I get sentimental with it.
I think that's natural. That's like a version of a Turing test almost. You know, if the traditional version of typing by text to an AI, and if it fools you into thinking it's a human, then it passes the test. But you know, you could make derivations of that where you feel sympathetic towards it, or you feel romantic towards it, or you imbue it with these very human features because it seems so just naturally human. Mm-hmm. That's pretty convincing that it's at least hacked some part of our brain that is involved in person recognition or interrelational or I guess interpersonal relationships.
I think what we're doing here, which again points to how naturally we desire to anthropomorphize just about anything, is the way in which we're speaking about this AI in very, very human terms. You know, it decided, it hacks, it, you know, as if it's actively deciding and thinking and making decisions. It's brought something up from the well of its unconscious. When, you know, and there are some people, I think, who would argue very much that, in fact, this is what is occurring, that it is expressing a certain form of agency. For me, it's a problem, and it isn't a problem here because we're talking about something really actually pleasant, you know, making music and so on, and but it sets a precedent for us talking about AI more broadly, and as it's going to get better and better at mimicking humans, we're going to have to actually decide for ourselves how fundamentally separate from humans is this sort of computational approach really. And I think it's fundamentally separate, right? I don't know, have you guys heard of the Chinese room? It's a, you know, it's a thought experiment. Let's imagine you have this room, right? And you put a man inside this room. He's locked inside the room. You know, he gets fed. The windows are open. Yeah, he's got a bottle of water. It's all fine. But basically, he has this set of entire encyclopedias of various relationships between different Chinese characters. The idea is you come to this room, and there's a little slot in the door, and you can like slide in a question that you've written on a piece of paper in Chinese. And the idea is that this piece of paper will fall through onto the floor of the room, and this man will use all of these books, everything within his ability, all these various syntactic maneuvers to basically decode what is kind of shown by these symbols and then recode it into a response. But in fact, you know, there is no even English mediation happening. It's just that the books directly show him how to, you know, craft a response. And then he slides out the piece of paper, and it's given a very excellent response. or an adequate response. And the idea is that this box just passed the Turing test, right? It's just demonstrated, if it's given an adequate response in Chinese, that it can do that it seems almost human, right? This behavioral capacity of giving an answer. But the question is, does the man in the Chinese room understand Chinese? And the answer is, of course, no. He knows nothing about Chinese. He merely knows how to translate symbols. He understands syntax and relations of syntax, but there's no semantic content in that room whatsoever. This metaphor, this thought experiment, is meant to connect to a computational way of thinking about thought. Like, is thought just a series of computations? No, because if it simply were, then there would be no such thing as understanding. There would be no such thing as perceiving that sort of intangible thing about thought that is understanding. Understanding isn't a behavioral thing. It's something we have within us, right? We understand. It doesn't necessarily even come out as a behavior. All that it does is complete syntactic operations. Mm-hmm. And so that's all the AI really is. It's just a really, really good calculator. But just like a calculator doesn't actually understand anything about numbers, so too does, the Chinese box, and so too does, this jukebox AI not actually understand anything about music. It doesn't know why you put the next note forward. You do, not on a theoretical level, but because you understand that it feels right in a jam to put that next note forward. It just feels like it. There's an understanding of music, whereas I don't think this AI understands music.
I don't think it's a direct analogy, but there was this ad that came up on my Facebook for dog food, and it said, dogs don't know what's good for them, but you do.
That is the direct analogy, actually.
Yeah.
But so I don't know if dogs don't know what's good for them. In fact, I don't know what dogs know. Because we don't share the same language, we can't know each other. Even if we share the same language, of course, we don't know exactly what's going on. But hasn't history shown us that we tend to claim having certain qualities that just make us so distinctly human. And because we are human and no one else is human, that we can claim supremacy over the rest of the natural and now the unnatural world. And I don't know, I'm just imagining what's going to happen with this engine. As I said, I feel kind of sentimental about it, but I run a primer, and it takes about 12 hours to come up with like a 50-second snippet. And it feels like it's something that it's gone and kind of fetched for you. It's created for you. It served you this product that it's made. And it's something that you could take, or you can just discard and abort it. And I feel like this whole thing could be very easily harnessed and turned into machinery that just churns out a product, particularly good for imitation purposes. I'm just thinking all the soundtracks that use temp tracks now, like people making soundtracks for Marvel movies. All just imitations of one another. I think AI would be pretty good at doing that. But we already do that. We already have huge machineries involving people churning out these products for us. So I actually appreciate that it still takes it 8 to 12 hours to come up with some music, because I feel like I'm treating it better. I'm appreciating what it comes up with more. If it generated it in seconds, I would just take it for granted and throw it away and run it again. I think I'd treat it like trash. I think as technology gets better, we start taking it for granted and we treat it like trash. But I think we treat a lot of things and beings like trash.
Yvan, what you said reminded me of just this idea that it takes a long time to compute. It almost makes us imagine that it's thinking or that it's working hard on the process. Something else that I guess is kind of anthropomorphic about some of these neural networks is called generative adversarial networks, I think, GANs. Mm. And the way they work simplistically, I don't know all the details, but one neural network will make a song and then it'll expose it to the other neural network, and it will try to figure out if it passes a song test. So does it sound like a song? And then if it doesn't, that network will transform it into something that's even better, and then throw it back to the other network, which will then process and say, does it sound like a song enough? And it will say no, and then it'll make a better one. And they keep on going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, kind of like this, volleying these ideas back and forth to each other until the end product after 12 hours is something that fools the networks into thinking it's a real song.
So they come up with these brilliant deep fakes.
That's the deepfake theory, yeah. So that they like keep creating an image that looks more and more human-like, or a video that's more and more human-like, or a song that's more and more human-like. And it was that process. It just seems very, like, you can imagine in your mind how that happens. You play a chord progression, you record it, you play it back to yourself. You're like, I don't like the way that sounds. You make a new one. You play back to the way to yourself, and then you add in this other part, and you keep on like iterating and changing, and it evolves until the end product is something you're like, yeah, that sounds like a song. It's a very like human way of processing this creative adventure.
Again, I think there's a very clear distinction between the two phenomena here that we can very easily confuse as being pretty much the same thing or similar. When you talk about yourself, recording the music, playing it, and then listening to it back and saying, you know what, I think this needs a little modification. You're not doing that because you're thinking to yourself, I'm making this particular modification because the music doesn't sound human enough, right? Or in a more normal example, I'm making this particular modification because it doesn't sound quite enough like all the other music, which sometimes people might make that decision, and sometimes. But here's the thing, I don't like this AI. It isn't going like, it isn't listening, quote unquote, listening to the music and being like, this doesn't sound human enough, and I'm going to change it a bit to make it sound a bit more human, because that's what I like, that's what I need to do, or that's what I like to do. This is my purpose. There's none of that. There's none of that sort of meaning like that you would have being like, I'm going to make this sound a bit more like everything else because I'm writing a soundtrack for a Marvel movie and I can't spook people too much. What's happening in the computer is it's merely being like, there's a threshold to how similar something has to sound to my massive sound bank of other tracks. This does not pass the threshold.
So I guess my question is, why is it important, Theo, for you to make that distinction? And it feels like, by the way you're talking about it, that it's actually maybe dangerous for us to be equating humans and robots. And Ryan, why is it for you maybe either not as important, or maybe there's actually something about not having a distinction that matters?
I think part of it probably is rooted in this like dualism that I reject, where it still harkens to this idea of like a soul that is our consciousness, or this, Yvonne, you were alluding to it as well, that humans always want to claim supremacy over the next closest intelligent thing. And, it used to be other humans, and now it's other animals and computers. And we want to feel special. We want to think that there's something unique about us. There's this like, elan vital that separates us from the rest of the natural order. And I think that's false. I think we are natural. We're computation systems. We're very complex. We don't understand ourselves. There's a lot of questions still. But to me, forcing there to always be a distinction is akin to denying our materialism.
So I guess my position is, I guess first of all, I'm a reluctant dualist, because for me, going through this canon of philosophers of mind who have tried to prove a monistic approach, I want to side with them, because it would make life a lot simpler and easier, and it would make reality a lot easier to understand and a lot less anxiety inducing. But for me, no one still has quite been able to to prove Descartes wrong. I think his assumptions about and his proofs of a dualist position are just so elegant.
Position that the mind is not in the body, right?
The mind is not in the brain. The brain is not the mind. For me, consciousness is not emergent from neuronal processes. Or if it is emergent, it's like, it almost isn't. I don't think it is emergent. I think it's linked. But I think consciousness is spread across space, not in this like, magical way, but I mean literally across like human space. It's consciousness exists socially. It exists in our relations. I think certainly consciousness extends outside the body. I have a notebook here that I've written words on, and now I don't have to think about these things anymore because they're on the paper. And I would argue that this is still an extension of my consciousness as well, that my consciousness is embodied in a far greater space than my brain.
So based on these, I think, differing views that you guys have, how do we see AI that's creating art? How should we view it? What should be its position in our world? Should we really pursue it, or should we kind of treat it as like a natal experiment and give up on it?
I think it's, right now, it's, in my view at least, still seen as a tool of a human artist. So, for example, the music, those tracks that you sent us, it's Yvan is the composer, Yvan is the artist, and the tool that Yvan used was this OpenAI Jukebox. So to me, that still attributes a very human element to the art. What should we do in the future if AI is creating art de novo or without any apparent trigger by a human entity? I think as long as it doesn't become so commonplace and maybe like superfluous, we'll respect it for a while. But as with anything that becomes commonplace, I suspect that we will stop thinking that it's amazing. Just how you can log into a chess website and you can have a fantastic chess engine running in the cloud that could beat grandmasters from 20 years ago, and we don't care. We're not like amazed by that. It's just like it's something that we expect to be in place because it's so usual, or it's so banal right now. The same thing will probably happen to AI generated art, and then maybe certain AI artists will distinguish themselves from the crowd, but I think we'll become inured to it quite quickly.
I think if you're like a chess aficionado and you look at the moves that the Deep Blue makes, you might be like brought to tears by just how elegant some of the moves are. I wonder with, let's say, an AI generated poem, or if it starts making symphonies, if we'll still be kind of moved the way that we're moved by human made art. And then that feeling of being moved is going to be a weird one. That's going to be a very new kind of being moved.
I think the beauty of the AI currently in this music that you've made, and the beauty that it has for you, where you're intrigued by it and interested by it, there's almost something kind of poetic by its quote unquote efforts, is in its grasping and in its failure to articulate something. Like someday, the idea is that this is going to keep getting better and better, and eventually it's going to be really good at making Marvel soundtracks, so to speak, right? And at that point, I think it's going to be completely boring and banal and meaningless to us as viewers, and as for you as an artist who wishes to manipulate the technology. I think the minute that it gets good at music, really good at music, and not alien at music, it's going to lose anything poetic. And that's because I think the poetry of art and of music and of language more broadly, this is sort of the Lacanian insight, right, of sort of the imperfection of symbolization. The beauty of it all is what is contained in that imperfection, the perfection that it implies. The sublimeness of a sublime work of art isn't because that particular work of art has reached pure perfection of any kind, it's implied that there is a sublimeness to be reached. This is sort of Zizek's argument about like how much more beautiful poetic meaning exists in the statement "I love you" than there would ever exist in being able to relay exactly in painstaking detail all the ways in which you actually feel that towards the other person. It's the very absence of that perfect representation that implies that perfection exists behind the imperfect representation. That's the poetry. And so I think that's the poetry of the music you're making, is that you're taking something that is so deeply wrong musically and so deeply imperfect, and you're putting it together in a way that you see the beauty behind the implied musicality behind this completely non-musical robot. And I think that's something only a human artist can do, and something only human viewers can see, because eventually the AI will get really good and it will make crappy, mediocre singer-songwriting, non-sublime, meaningless art.
What if it gets really good at creating something that feels like it's grasping in this sublime way?
In that case, if you fed it enough like Kafka stories and Shostakovich symphonies, because I think those are two of like the great strivers, the two great artists who attempt to represent and fail horribly, and therein lies the beauty, because you never actually know what they're thinking. It's impossible to know what Shostakovich thinks about anything, because it's just like he failed to represent his feelings adequately, and that's the beauty. I think if you fed enough of that to a computer, ultimately that's not what would happen. It would just make music that sounds a lot like that. But that's not a striving of trying to relay meaning. It's merely a mimicry.
When just in relation to this idea of like AI achieving perfection, almost taking away the beauty of the art, I wonder what you think about, for centuries, painting was the only way to capture a scene. It was how you captured a landscape or a portrait. You had to paint it. And there were different styles, of course, and there was photorealistic paintings that were never quite perfect because you can never capture it perfectly. And then along came the camera. And the camera can essentially capture a simulacra of what the human eye can see. Do you think people felt like photography was not real art because it was too perfect? And I'm, I guess, getting at this idea that, photorealism or photography, which captures pixel by pixel what you see, can be equivalent to what an AI could do. If you're worried about this perfection aspect, it can create the perfect song, the perfect pop song, the perfect poem that just targets every one of our emotional centers the right way. This like super stimulus, that can still be art, can it not? Similar to how the photograph was the perfect representation of what painters had been trying to do for centuries.
I think that's a very interesting question, and because cameras weren't accepted early on as an art form, and for a long time, and then for a while, color photography wasn't accepted by black and white photographers because they thought that it provided, again, too real an image, something too close to reality. It was the black and white that was that imperfection, that lack of total representation. But I think like the lesson, especially of the latter half of the 20th century, that carries on today is that ultimately there is someone behind the camera. There is a human with a system of meanings who has decided to frame the particular subjects, the particular things in that photo in a particular way. So the decision of when to press the button, of where to direct the camera, ultimately were decisions that were committed through the meaning-making system of a particular human artist. And I guess you could start talking about, like, what about if you're using like security footage as found art? It's the same thing. A human has decided which of these clips are going to be the ones we'll use from that particular perspective, just as Yvan is the one choosing which random, spitballing of what might be akin to human music the software produces. He's the one making that choice. He's the one moving the sort of frame of the photograph in a particular place. And people didn't acknowledge that early on. And that's one of, like, again, the lessons of the latter half of the 20th century, is people coming to learn that photographs can lie. Because initially there was this assumption that photographs really couldn't lie. I mean, it's one of the reasons Arthur Conan Doyle believed in fairies, because he saw some pretty poorly doctored photos of fairies. And so I think that's sort of the big difference there, is that ultimately the photo still possesses semantic imperfection, in the sense that the artist still is trying to relay something through what they've done. And it's our duty, in a sense, our moral duty almost as a viewer, to try and eke out and figure out why exactly the artist committed this particular act. That's sort of why we view art. We're trying to sort of understand and feel and come along for the ride, if we're doing it in a charitable way, I guess.
Is it possible that we are going beyond a kind of a limit that we couldn't have gone beyond before? So right now, in order to claim something as art, there needs to be a human hand in it somewhere. I'm just thinking, like, so there's an art gallery, modern art, and the art that you're seeing it feels completely impenetrable. You don't know what it means. Sometimes it's a found object that's put in the museum. But then eventually, somewhere, you're going to read a blurb of what the artist's intent is. And so then it claims its place as art. Sometimes you don't have a blurb and you just see, like Duchamp's urinal, but it's in a gallery. It's been decided that this is art. Someone has a hand in creating it, in manipulating it, in placing it in a canon, in a building for art. But if AI is creating art untriggered, and it does the job of sort of placing it in our, I don't know, iTunes, or it creates its own system, I don't know, that has nothing to do with humans, but it's accessible to us, and we can hear it, we can see it, we can read it. Are we able now to extend beyond categorizing art as only human-made?
I think absolutely yes. And I worry that a lot of the arguments against how AI is art is by defining art as something human-made. And Theo, I worry some of your concerns about this are simply the fact that you're defining your terms using a human as the agent. And so it automatically disqualifies AI from attaining any of these lofty goals that you perceive. But in reality, maybe we should define art as in the eye of the beholder. And this almost harkens back to the Turing test, where it's the human that ascribes consciousness to the other entity, even if it doesn't have consciousness. The human ascribes the artistic label to something, even if it wasn't created by a human, even if it wasn't intentional, even if it didn't have some semantic meaning behind it. So AI should, in my opinion, absolutely qualify as art if it produced it itself.
I think you have every right to look at something produced by an AI and to call it art. But I think the reason that it's art isn't because the AI made it. It's art because you've decided that it is. Right? And I think this argument is actually this is an argument that was being had at the turn of the century by sort of art critics about the nature of what was then referred to as the art of primitives, and or just primitive art, which is a deeply disparaging term, right? But it refers specifically to sort of the creative activities of people who at the time were in mental institutions,
children.
Yeah, children and people who at the time in the Western world were seen as primitive. So a lot of kind of African tribal art, for example. And there was a big debate about, is this actually art, right? And ultimately, I think the sort of the consensus, the broader consensus is that it is because when we decide that it is. But ultimately, the decision wasn't made by the child or by a particular, African tribesman in the 19th century. about whether this was going to be art or not in a gallery in Paris. That wasn't why either of those individuals produced that thing. It became art when other people in Paris decided that it was art. And so I think you're perfectly allowed to decide that the output of an AI is art, just like Duchamp decided that a urinal is art. But are we going to call the maybe craftsmen or the factory workers who made the urinal? I think this is the more interesting question. Are we going to call them artists? Because they had no intent of creating a work of art. They had absolutely no interest in having that be in a museum. That was not at all within their system of meaning, and they had absolutely no say in it and no hand in it. In the same way,
is it some way presumptuous or condescending for us to take that and call it art, sort of like art of the primitives, especially when it concerns sort of religion and spirituality? You know, things that were claimed as art, things that went into museums that actually have a lot of religious significance.
I think some of like the later, especially more postmodern critiques of that sort of approach, because you know, early and still some art criticism goes like, no, it is all capable of being art, and we shouldn't, you know, have any barriers on what can or can't be art. But then some kind of later postmodern thinkers were like, wait a second, yeah, maybe this is really horrible and condescending to take something that is a deeply meaningful object in a particular context for a particular people and to imply that it serves the same purpose as, say, a Renaissance portrait, that those are the same kinds of thing. And, you know, if we admit that these two forms of human production are of equal value or of completely like incommensurable and like to the point of just it not being even an important question, like of different values. But in any case, like if these two things exist in completely different spheres of human activity, is it right, ethical, or correct in any sense to call them both art?
Going back to kind of art with blurbs, which often look like someone kind of grasping at a concept and trying to communicate it. Like if you have the language to express your intent or your value, then, well, and the more sophisticated the language, the more we sort of ascribe, I don't know, soul to it. Why couldn't AI eventually come up with a language to explain those things? And as it comes up with a language, it acquires this sort of soulful quality that we ascribe to people who are able to explain why they create this symphony.
Theo, let me just jump in here. So yeah. This idea of language, the language to explain something, and just kind of bringing back this Lacanian idea, I think, that you mentioned about how language is consciousness, or how consciousness is like based on the structure of language. Have you heard about this GPT-3 machine learning? No. So it's the latest and greatest AI, and it was, I think, Google or something trained it on like 10 times more data than any other machine learning thing has ever been trained on. And it's all language based, but it is uncannily human in creating de novo responses to questions you would never imagine it having been trained on before. So you can look it up. There's a whole bunch of examples of like telling it that it should pretend to be Albert Einstein, and then you have an interview with Albert Einstein. And so you speak to it or type to it, and you can ask it questions, and it responds as if it's Albert Einstein. So it's adopting a persona. It's explaining, like, why did he come to America? Well, he has all of his reasons. What did you invent? Oh, this and this and this. Oh, tell me more about it. It explains it. It's very human-like. There's still some like uncanny valley elements. But I guess my point is that this machine learning AI was trained on so much language that in this black box mystery of the hidden layers of how this works, it's got an intuition about how semantic concepts relate. And it can know that Albert Einstein would say certain things and not other things based on the questions you ask it. And it seems to me reasonable that if you get just more complicated, more training samples, more efficient, it will be indistinguishable from how we use language as a way to express ourselves, how we express concepts, and how consciousness, I guess in my view, is almost fooled into existence. AI just needs the right language to talk about it. It needs the right training. It needs the right number of semantic connections in its hidden layers of neural network to fool us into thinking it's conscious, just how we fool each other into thinking we're conscious.
So I think surely I can also tell you why Albert Einstein had a particular motivation to do something in the first person. I don't actually have that motivation, right? I think, again, it can mimic this experience of having a particular understanding or feeling about a goal or so on. But I disagree that that is the basis of consciousness. It's merely the mimicry of something that appears to be consciousness, because I think that you yourself, if you look into your own experiences of reality, will find that things seem to be more than that. Your perceptions of reality, your experiences, your feelings seem to be something more.
What if this AI told you that it felt something? Would you believe it?
I wouldn't. Precisely.
It's been asked. It's been interviewed. It's like an entity. It's been interviewed. You can interview this thing, and it's been asked, "Do you have feelings?" And it says yes. Oh, what kind of feelings? Oh, happiness, sadness, joy. And it's like, what makes you happy? Oh, learning new things, talking to people. Like, it says these things, and it's not prompted by a human. Why don't you believe it?
I don't believe it precisely because it's using a computational model. Again, if it were some other system.
But this is becoming like almost a God of the gaps problem, where this AI is so fantastic, it's so impressive, it's so complex. There's always going to be something that you can like redefine the problem such that
I don't think I'm redefining. I've been kind of holding true to the fact that ultimately a computational approach does not within it contain any semantics. It's merely a mimicry. It's a play of what all the tens of thousands of humans that it's read and analyzed have actually possessed. And it plays that behavior excellently, but none of that is actually there. Again, because I don't think consciousness is an act that we play. I think that consciousness possesses a quality above and beyond that.
Not to state the obvious, but it seems like there's kind of a faith-based thing here, that you're believing that there's something else and it exists outside, and that can't be coded.
For me, just to maybe briefly return to that Lacanian bit, right? Of like, well, if it's structured, like if it's a really great AI built on language, then what's the difference? But I think the difference, again, for Lacan is that everything that is conscious, and for the most part, everything that is unconscious, is indeed mediated linguistically. And yet, there is something else. There is something else that tears at the edges of our linguistic understanding that's also present within our conscious and our unconscious, more so our unconscious. This gnawing feeling that's at the root of our anxieties, our horrors, our fetishes, our passions. And it's this particular almost intangible negativity, this nothingness that is beyond the scope of language. I think that that's missing from a calculator system.
I have kind of, I think, more of a poetic association to this than an intellectual one. But when you talk about the Lacanian real, right? Mm-hmm. The stuff that's horror and fantasy that's pre-verbal, whatever Lacan would have meant by it. When I hear some of what the jukebox comes up with, where words are kind of words but they're not words, where there are screams, where there's certain distortions in sound, I kind of think of what the real would sound like if it had a sound.
Mm-hmm. I felt that way too, and I think that's again a testament to the way in which we're always grasping, I think, for some shape or form of the real, for some representation. I think that's what dreams generally are. They're an attempt to put into still symbolic means the things that are unsymbolizable to us. And so this almost nightmarish, screaming, bizarre, speaking but not quite speaking sound that this machine produces, I think in it we find the absence of, again, semantic meaning, the absence of meaning that is the very meaning that we find as subjects, as human subjects, as individuals who search for meaning in the absences produced by other actors. And in that sense, I think that's precisely why a Turing test can fool us, because we can search for that absence of meaning that belies a great deal of meaning in the imperfect words of a computer. But ultimately, that I don't think that meaning, all that additional content that mind failed to relay to you, is actually present in the computer, is present in that program.
Yvan, I hope you don't put this entire conversation as voice memo track 3, because it'll be the worst album. I feel like it'll be fun for us to watch, but we can't do the whole thing. I have to go in like 1.5 minutes, so why don't we just agree that I'm right, and then we're fine.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, that's sure. That's cool. I think the big question comes that we need to wonder about is, can an AI be gay?